Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Bridge TV. Today, or this evening, we have a great guest, a prominent figure in Islamic studies and Islamic history. Historian, writer. It's honor, very great honor to have you with us, Mr. Dan Gibson. What an honor to have you, sir. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we're going to go to the subject straight. First, the tradition of this channel is that the guest tell us about himself. Can you tell us about yourself, where you're from, what you study, and so on?
Okay, yeah, I'm just having some sound trouble here. Yeah. I'm Dan Gibson. I'm a Canadian. At the age of 21 years old, I went to the Middle East. Interested in history. My family were interested in history. I grew up knowing about the ancient history. My father and my grandfather were both very interested in history, and so I had an interest in history. And so in 1979, I arrived in the Middle East. That's about 40 years ago. And I started out with Arabic study and then was moved around into different countries. And my wife and I have lived in Jordan for many years. We've lived in the Emirates. We've lived in Yemen for about 4 years. And I've traveled through the Middle East extensively. During that time, there was people would ask me about, have you read the Quran? And it was challenging. And I said, maybe I should read the Quran, but I want to be able to ask some questions. And so as I went through the Quran, my questions were about when did this take place and where did it take place? And I was interested in the geography of the places and so forth. And during that time, I came across a number of mosques. These mosques, people would tell me, oh yeah, this mosque points to Jerusalem. I said, oh really? Well, this mosque. And then I would be in another place and they would say, oh yeah, now this mosque is a very early mosque. It points to Jerusalem. So that had me very interested to know, well, where are these mosques and how many and so forth. So I began to study Islamic history and I began to look at the geography and tried to put the geography and the history and the archaeology together. And I had a lot of problems doing that.
So it was like a self-interest, or you just wanted to go a scientific way? How you want to find out? Did you ever think about joining the Muslim nation and believing in Islam? And
no, everyone talked to me, have you submitted, and and do you know about Islam? And I read my Quran, I did all these things, but I had a lot of questions, especially about how does it all fit together. Yeah.
In this case, you spent a long time there. Did you learn to speak Arabic?
Yes. When I first got there, I did about 2 years of Arabic study. And I discovered I'm not good at learning languages. So it was a lot of work.
So, I mean, were you able to read the Quran in Arabic?
I'm sorry?
Were you able to read the Quran in Arabic?
I worked my way through some of it, but I could read it in English and then I could compare and look at the words in Arabic and so forth. Now, my wife did much better than I did, and she was able to really move ahead in the Arabic language. In my studies, I usually use English. Then I can do word studies in Arabic. I can go and look. I have resource people who are very good in Arabic grammar. I can go and ask them, what about this word? What does it mean? Because it should be an Arab who, with Arab language and real good skills in the language to deal with it. And so I have not tried to excel on the Arabic side, but tried to understand the history side. And it means reading through many, many books. And so, for instance, if I'm reading Al-Tabri and I have a question, wonder what this means. I'm reading in English. I can turn to Al-Tabri's history here in Arabic, and I can check the words, and then I can get a hold of my Arab friends, of scholars and people who know Arabic well, and then ask them, how exactly does this word mean? How, can this be translated some other way? So it means I can work with Arabic, but my speaking Arabic is not good, especially after having been back here in Canada for the last 15 years. My speaking has been going downhill.
We have lots of Arabic speaking. Can you tell them something that they can make sure that you speak some Arabic? Can you tell them something now?
Okay. المشكلة يعني اللغة دي مش كويس يعني
المشكلة اللغة مش كويس
بس أنا بفهم كتير المشكلة الأحكي يعني.
Okay, but you can read, but the pronunciation.
أيوة. Yes, I can read, yeah.
Interested in history in general, but then Islamic history piqued your interest.
Yeah.
All right. And how did that start exactly? Because you started with the Qibla and Kaaba and Jerusalem and so on, and Petra also. How did that start?
My focus was quite early on, as I thought I want to find out where are these mosques that point to Jerusalem. And so I began to make a list of them because different people said my mosque points to Jerusalem. And I soon discovered, I think there's too many mosques that point to Jerusalem, that people were saying it points to Jerusalem. And it's difficult for me to figure out how would that fit into just a few months. Muhammad, the story is told us in Bukhari tells it and others that they only prayed for a few months to the north, and Bukhari he only uses the word Quds once. He usually says a sham, that they prayed that way, or prayed to the north or to Damascus. It's not clear, and so he's not very clear on it. And so I thought, how can there be mosque, and how can there be a mosque in Oman that faces this way? So I decided to make a list, and I thought it won't take very long. I'll just make look at a few early mosques and see how is the Qibla oriented, and so which way did people face when they stood in that mosque. And that's when I had the big surprise, because I all of a sudden realized there are lots of early mosques that are there from the first few centuries of Islam. I just looked at the first 2 centuries, the first 200 years. And that's when I realized something is not the same. Archaeology is telling a different story than I was reading in Bukhari and in Al-Tabri and in other places. And so it was hard to try to put, and so I've been working for the last 10, 15 years and putting the Islamic story together with the archaeological story. So it's probably helpful to first talk about the archaeological story. What do the stones tell us? And then to go back and say, well, how do we fit this into Islamic history? Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Actually, that would be my next question. I'm going to skip one question to go there. With the first question I got you. In 1987, there were major renovation in Qiblatain Mosque, Masjid al-Qiblatain in Medina, in Medina, in Saudi Arabia, by Abdul al-Wakil. And you found that something, they did not actually know. Let's say, what did they find? Did they find anything? Any Islamic history, any Islamic record?
Okay. In the Qiblatain Mosque, traditionally everyone learned there's 2 Qiblas. One Qibla that faces Mecca and Saudi Arabia, and one Qibla that said faced Jerusalem. And so when they wanted to rebuild that mosque, they dug down and they discovered the original foundations of the Qiblatain Mosque. And it did have 2 Qiblas, one that the modern one pointed to Mecca and Saudi Arabia, but the first Qibla pointed north, and there's a line that goes north and it goes up to Jerusalem. But it also passes through other places on the way up north. So for me to find out where did the first Qibla point, I needed more than just one mosque. I needed multiple mosques. And so that's when I started doing my research and finding the mosques, find out where did they line up to pray and what angle, where were they facing? And I started lining these up. And the first mosques in the first 100 years of Islam, listen carefully, in the first 100 years of Islam, I did not find a single mosque that faced to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. There's not a single mosque in the first 100 years. They all faced somewhere else. And so that's what I found amazing, is that when I started lining these up, and this is from the east, from the west, from the north, from the south, looking at mosques, and they all pointed to one place in southern Jordan. And all those lines come together. And that's what we made the documentary film about.
All right, great. Now you're talking about one direction and one city only, which is Petra in Jordan.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it when I got it. I couldn't believe this. This can't be true. And so I started working on remeasuring and rechecking everything, checking all of the dates and so forth. So the problem is to find a mosque that has not been torn down and rebuilt. So if there are some mosques, like the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, it has been totally torn down and rebuilt, and so we can no longer tell how that original mosque was.
This is, I think, it's really questionable and pique my concern. Why did they demolish the only historic mosque they have there? What do you think?
I think it was for size. I mean, the first mosques were actually very small. This
is the second largest religion on earth. I mean, why they could have built something next door.
Right, but all of these mosques were torn down and rebuilt multiple times. Every 300 or 400 years, the caliph would come along and let's tear it down and let's build a new one, because the building got old and they wanted it bigger and more impressive. And so as they did that, many of these mosques, you can't tell the original direction of the mosque. The Quba Mosque, for instance, it's been rebuilt so many times, we can't tell where it originally faced and what it was. So the important thing is to find other mosques that have not been rebuilt, maybe were abandoned, and there they were, or descriptions of mosques. So we can go to one in Cairo, and there's an early description where they describe how everyone would face east from the mosque, exactly east. And it was later, after 100 years into Islam, that they changed the mosque so that the Qibla would face Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So for the first 100 years, not a single mosque, the Qiblas did not face Saudi Arabia at all.
Well, in the meantime, there was no Mecca. I think before I have the record, there was no record of Meccan history there. Before
everyone. I mean, Muslims have all been taught that Mecca has been there forever, and it's the center of the world, and it's and all these things. But if you go back and look at archaeological record, there is no record back then. If you remember, just the last few years, the Saudis went in and bulldozed the whole area around the Kaaba to rebuild that, and there was no ancient ruins there. I spoke back in 2002. I was at a conference where there were historians and archaeologists.
That was my next.
And I found the Saudi archaeologists, and I asked them, tell me about the archaeological record in the city of Mecca. Have you discovered anything that goes back? I mean, we need to go back to the time of Muhammad or even 100 years after that. Is there anything? And they sort of looked around to make sure nobody was listening, and they said, there's nothing there. There is no archaeological record.
So talking about they were looking around, did you feel any danger while you were working on this?
No, I'm looking for the truth. And I think Muslims everywhere understand I'm trying to search out the truth and honestly find out what happened in the first 100 years of Islam. I want to know, the real truth. And I'd like Muslims with me to help me and to look back, and we can try to discover what really happened.
Let's go back to the same year 2000 where you were in that Nabatean studies by Hussein bin Talal University. Now, there was not anything, no record of Mecca 800 AD. So what was their answer? You said their answer. Was it surprising to you? What happened and why? Is it surprising to you and why? Because you were expect they will defend the idea like Qura, you know, like the mother of all town, walls, merchants. Where like did they defend anything?
They have said there's nothing there, because the description of early Mecca is that there were walls, there were lots of temples, the temple of Dushera, the temple of Alat, all of these temples should have been there, the temple of Al-Uzza. These are described in the histories as being in the city of Mecca in the time of Muhammad, but there are no ancient temples. There's nothing there. The archaeologists said that we don't have any of that there. And the descriptions don't fit very well because Mecca is an agricultural city. It has, grapes growing and it has grass growing and crops there. It has lots of trees and water and things. And it just doesn't sound like Mecca that we know today.
According to Islamic scripture, but not what you found.
Sorry?
That's according to Islamic scripture, not what you found. What you found is all these gardens and grapes and whatever, some elsewhere in Petra, not in Mecca.
That's right. If we take the descriptions of Mecca and then we go to the city of Petra, where all the mosques, everyone was facing this place, then you find everything's there. The temple of Dushera is there. The temple of Al-Uzza, it's there. All the agriculture they describe, it is there. All of the descriptions fit in the city of Petra, and they don't. And even the idea of the Thania, these narrow cracks where you come through, this fits Petra. I've asked where are these Thanias in Mecca, and they don't have them. In the city of Petra, they have sacred stones that were placed all around the sacred area. And they don't have these in Mecca. Come to Petra and we'll show you. They're very huge, large stones that mark out Masjid al-Haram, and this is the area around the outside. So I find, and in the books that we've written and in the videos, we've got now 50 different things that line up with Petra, but not with Mecca. I mean, we could go through topic after topic.
Okay. Okay, in which period of history of Islam, Kaaba or Qibla has changed? Why and why?
That was a big question. Why did the Mecca get, people started praying to Mecca 100 years later? So what made the change of focus? So what I did is I went back, I took the archaeology. Archaeology gives us dates and gives us times. It's here. And then I came and took Islamic history to put over top so I could see what is happening at the same time. So I said, okay, here's when the change took place. What does Islamic history tell me? I go back, I read Al-Tabri, and I discover there's a man named Ibn Zubair, and he is fighting against Damascus, and he says he wants to be the Caliph. Well, they make him the Caliph. And so he is in rebellion. The army comes down from Damascus. And so during that time, the Kaaba gets destroyed. The black stone, the black rock is put onto a wooden stand. And thought, wow, this is right at the time when, this Qibla changed. And here I'm reading this stuff. I read about Ibn Zubair's brother, Musab. He comes and he brings a lot of camels and a lot of wagons and a lot of different things, horses, and to move the people. Now, he doesn't say where they moved them to, but you begin to look through the history. You find in Kufa, the people say to Ibn Zubair, well, we now pray to the same Qibla as you do. That's a strange question. Comment, because Muslims, don't they all pray to the same Qibla? But here he's telling Ibn Zubair, we pray to the same Qibla that you do. And so how did we get that comment? How could some people pray to a different Qibla? Those kinds of things you find scattered through Islamic history. And so we can find bits and pieces. So it looks as if about 70 years after the Hijrah, that is when the rock was moved down to Saudi Arabia. Now, I can suggest why or how it worked. The history won't tell us because it's silent on this subject. But my suggestion is Ibn Zubair, who was in the city of Petra and was rebelling, and we can go to Petra. They used a big manjanik to throw stones up and smash against the Kaaba building. We can find those stones. We can trace that war. All the descriptions of Ibn Zubair being in the capital city all fit him being in Petra, not in Mecca.
Did you just mention the word?
The stones, the trebuchet stones are still there.
So did you just mention the word manjanik in Arabic?
I don't know. That's what it's called.
Yeah. Okay. No, I'm trying to make sure because I expect to say catapult, but great. I mean, I got it. So your Arabic is clear. So okay, Abdullah ibn Zubair.
Yes.
But also there are studies by so many scholars. They think or they promote that. The fifth caliph, the Umayyad caliph, Abdul Malik bin Marwan, who is the one who created Islam, who has the biggest thing to do with Islam. There was no Muhammad, no the four right-guided caliphs. That all stories, not truth. Can you elaborate on this? What did you find in this history?
It's very hard for me to say if a story is true or not. I personally generally take the stories as being as true as they could be. The stories we have come from Al-Tabari and from Ibn Ishaq and others. They were actually trying to write down real history. I don't think they were making things up, but they were under some restraints. If you need to get the history in your mind so that the beginning we have the first caliphs. We don't have anything written down by those caliphs. Abu Bakr and Uthman and Umar, they didn't write anything down. And then we have the caliphs that were in Damascus, Muawiyah and these guys. And again, they personally didn't record anything down that we have records of. What we have comes from the time of the Abbasids. So we're talking 200 or 300 years later. And so now they're writing down the history 300 years later. And I think they were being serious. I mean, Bukhari, he goes around and listens to thousands and thousands of different stories, trying to determine what is correct, what is sahih, and what is weak, and what is strong, and so forth. This whole science developed because they were trying to remember what happened 300 years before. They did not have a written record. Now, Al-Tabari and these others, they could not write anything that reflected negatively on Islam or on the Prophet or on the Abbasid rulers of their time. So they had to go through and carefully pick out. But if there was something that reflected poorly, they couldn't reflect on it. So a lot of people ask, well, how could they change from one Qibla to another? Well, if it's a long story, but the rock was moved first, not the Qibla. The rock was moved first because Ibn Zubair wanted to capture it and get it away from the caliph in Damascus. So he's got to take the rock and move it. I don't think he ever thought he was changing the Qibla. I don't think he ever thought he's building another Kaaba. I don't think he ever thought that's going to be another Masjid al-Haram and so forth. I mean, I think he just put the rock down there and moved some people down there and kept it safe while he's fighting the war. And so in time, and it all hinges around one man, and his name is Hajjaj. And he is the key guy if you're studying history. He is the Hajjaj. He's a general in the army. He is the one who's responsible for just about everything that happened after that. And so if you go back and read his story, you'll find a lot about him. Now, Hajjaj, he's the general who sent down from Damascus, and he's been told, now don't kill anybody in the sacred place, don't do anything. But he doesn't. He just walks in and he kills people, he massacres them, there's a bloody battle. And when he gets done, he doesn't like the city of Petra with the Kaaba there and with everything, because it's a pagan city. It's not pure or whatever. He doesn't like where the rock is being kept, because those are still rebels. So when Hajjaj goes back over to Iraq, and there he's they make him the governor over Iraq, and he gets to build a mosque, his mosque, the Hajjaj mosque. And so his problem is, what Qibla does he face? Do they face towards Petra, as all the mosques up till then did? Or does he choose Mecca, where the Black Rock is? But that's a bunch of rebels. So he does something. He builds a mosque, and he calls it the Wasit Mosque. And that's from Mutawassit. It's between. And he points to a place in the middle of Saudi Arabia. And every mosque that is built by Al-Hajjaj, or by the people under the Iraq and where he is at and in Syria, all of those mosques face to the middle of Saudi Arabia. They're all Wasit mosques. And so it's not until later that historians write back and say the problem was with Hajjaj, and the problem was with the Caliph at that time, that he allowed there to be multiple Qiblas developed. So it wasn't just that we have Petra, now we have Mecca, now we have between, and at that very same time, the people in North Africa, they change their Qibla and they start pointing to an African Qibla down in South Africa. So today, when I go back and look, if you go to the tool on the internet called the Qibla tool, you can find the first 100 years of Islam. There's over 20 mosques that point to Petra that remain. We can go there, we can examine them. We have 20 mosques pointing to Petra. Then we have about 22 mosques that point to the between position. We have more than 20 that point to the parallel. I call it a parallel. It's a line between Petra and Mecca. Here, that's the Qibla they use over in North Africa and in Spain. It goes down at a 155-degree angle. It's not nowhere near the Kaaba. They just parallel what's going on over here. So it's not until the Abbasids come along, they take over and they rewrite history. They put it all straight. They do not want to talk about all of this Qibla trouble in the first 100 years of Islam. I think there's some shame attached to it. You pick that up if you're reading the Byzantines. There's a Byzantine patriarch there in Constantinople, and he's having a debate with the Muslim rulers, and he's saying, we know what Hajjaj did. We know how he made changes in Islam. That they even accuse the Muslims of Hajjaj of making some changes in the Quran. He said, we know he added some verses in the Quran. And so this Hajjaj guy, he has introduced a lot of stuff. So later, the Abbasids, they're embarrassed. They're embarrassed with Hajjaj. They're embarrassed with all the trouble they had. And so everything in the histories now is just, it's all covered over. So you don't know about it. I mean, I've lived in the Middle East long enough to know that shame is covered over. If something shameful happens, everybody covers it over. Didn't happen, and just forget about it. Just be quiet. And I think that is what happened here. It was all covered over. Just forget about it. The historians just touch on it a few places, but they're not allowed to bring it up because there's something shameful in the history, and so it's not there. And so now we go back with archaeology. We get the rocks, we look at them, and they tell a different story than what Al-Tabari is telling us.
You are so right about the culture and the shame in that culture, and how necessary it is to cover it. Now, you mentioned, okay, I have several questions now of you. Don't you think it's strange that Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, and four caliphs, they were controlling from Morocco all the way to India, without single record. I mean, that
there weren't many records. They weren't writing things down. But there were several times in which records were destroyed. You know, when the Quran was being written down, then suddenly one of the caliphs said, well, just burn everything we got and let's go back and start again with just a couple of them. So this burning of literature, it's in the history, it's there, and it's happened several times that things were burned. And so there wasn't very much respect for books or for writing, especially anything outside of the Quran. If it wasn't the Quran, then it had no use. When General Amr went into Egypt, he found a lot of books and a lot of scrolls. He wrote back to the Caliph, said, "What do I do with all of these?" And the Caliph said, "You know, if they are different from the Quran, burn them. If they're the same as the Quran is better, so burn them." So they burned books. It took 6 months for them to burn all the books that they found.
That was the Caliph Omar in Alexandria, Egypt, who burned the entire great library in Egypt. Yeah. And now, the first one you mentioned
found were burned. So my point is there is no respect for written materials. And so I don't think, in many cases, I don't think they deliberately did things, but just as they came in and they conquered and they looted and took things, books didn't have any respect. And so we don't find a lot of the record. And so that's why we had to have people like Al-Tabri and Ibn Ishaq try to go back and put the history together and to ask, do you remember what your grandfather told you, that you're from your father and your grandfather and your great-grandfather? Imagine if we tried to do that today for the American Civil War. Nobody's alive, but we tried to figure out what was this war about, and all we had to do was go back and ask questions and work our way back. So a lot of things got lost. One interesting, just a little thing I noticed, we are told that in the early days, there were some hadiths that talk about Muhammad giving sermons in a Roman bathhouse. And when Bukhari came along, he said that can't be true. There's no Roman bathhouse in Mecca. So they got rid of and destroyed all of the sermons of Muhammad that were in the Roman bathhouse. Now, when I went to Petra, and there we find the actual Kaaba building, and there we find the trebuchet stones where they knocked it all down. What's right beside the Kaaba? I mean, there's a temple, there's other things, but right near it is a Roman bathhouse. And when I saw the Roman bathhouse, I said, oh, they got rid of all of those sermons of Muhammad. They just got rid of them because it couldn't be true. And so this is the problem. 300 years later, they're trying to decide what is correct and what isn't. What is a strong hadith and what is a weak hadith? And they couldn't tell, the same as I couldn't tell you what's a strong hadith or story about the Civil War in America and what isn't, because without having actual accounts of people there who remembered, it's very, very difficult to put those things together.
It's okay. Is there any one from Islam or Arabs try to reinvestigate the Roman bathhouse you're talking about, or they just took the Tabari or Bukhari story? Well,
Bukhari and others, they got rid of those. I mean, back more than 1,000 years ago, all of that stuff was lost. All we know is that they were dismissed anything because there is no Roman bathhouse in Mecca. There couldn't be a Roman bathhouse in Mecca. So anything that talked about Muhammad and the bathhouse, they got rid of. And that's all we know from back then. It's all been lost.
So that's now this hadith supports your story and your research.
Yeah, when I saw the bathhouse, I'm like, oh my. Bukhari got destroyed well, I don't know if he destroyed them. He just ignored them, and nobody collected those hadiths because they couldn't be true.
Were anyone from Islamic scholars, countries, any Islamic thing were interested in your founding, in your research? what you found about the Roman bathhouse?
Well, I can't do anything more about the Roman bathhouse except to notice that it was there. Let's go back, though, and talk a bit about the Kaaba building, because I'm the only one who says this is the Kaaba building. There is a cube-like structure in Petra. It's just the foundation. When we go back and look, all we can see are the foundations. And I remember when it was being excavated and that whole area around it, and they found a wall around the courtyard, and then there's around the wall goes around something. You can see it curving around and so forth. And there was a lot of wondering what this is as the archaeologists look at it. But it just sat there for all this time. And I went, as I was looking, saying, well, where these trebuchet stones were and where they would have been thrown over the wall and came in, and is there a place from the wall that you can actually hit the Kaaba building? And then I realized here's this stone block, but it's not a cube, it's a little bit longer, and all four sides are different lengths, so it's not exactly square, it's a little bit off, and angles are a little different. And then I came across a guy by the name of Azraqi. Let me pull him off the shelf. I have not found Azraqi anywhere in English, so this is only in Arabic. And his family goes back to keeping the Kaaba and the time of Muhammad. And so he tells us about Muhammad's time, and he tells us the dimensions. He said, here are the measurements of the sides of the Kaaba during Muhammad's time. And I compared his measurements with the measurements in Petra, and all four measurements fit. He has measured that building. And then if you get a satellite photo so you can look down from the top, you see here's the building, and you see there's a wall around the courtyard, and there's a hatam. There's a curve in the wall. Now, that's important because it wasn't until the Abbasid caliphs that they decided to move the hatam and attach it to the Kaaba building itself, so it's that curved wall around the front. Now, one of the problems there's so much here, it's hard to know how to describe it all. One of the problems we have here is that in Islamic history, both Petra and Mecca are given the name Mecca. So are they talking about this Mecca, or are they talking about that Mecca? Very interesting to know. We found some Christian historians writing back in early times, and they talk about the city of Mecca in southern Jordan, in Paran, and so forth. And so we recognize that the city of Petra is a name that comes from the Greek and comes from the Roman world, and that's the name we call it today. That was not the name of the city. It was known as Rechem to some people. It had multiple different names. The Petra scrolls. Now I've got a book right back here. This whole series of books go through the Petra scrolls, and in the Petra scrolls, it is called the city of Petra, and they would write official letters and saying, to so and so from the city of Petra, the mother of all cities. Only they don't say city; it's the mother of all settlements. Qura is the term they use. So here we are, the mother of all settlements. It is, it's all the names that are described to the city of Mecca are actually all found in history referring to the city of Petra. It is actually also called Mecca. And it's called Sila. It's Mount Sila. And there's many, many different names there. And so as we go back, it's important to dig back into the history of Petra and to find out what the city was called, because we only know it by the Western English name of Petra. It had its own names. It was the mother of all cities. It was a great metropolis and so forth. So there's many different names. It was the blessed city. It was the holy city. There are lots of different terms that were used for the city of Petra. And going back, we've discovered that not only is the city of Petra have all those names, it has all the places. It was a city of pilgrimage. For many, many years, people came to Petra for pilgrimage. So if you want to watch some of the videos, you can watch the one on the Petra pilgrimage and discover the last year that people took pilgrimage to Petra was in 1985. I mean, that's when the government put a stop. They put a fatwa on it. Nobody's allowed to go there anymore. But up till that time, there were still people going there. There still was a place. I mean, there's a big flat area that's been built up with a column. People could throw stones at the column. You can go climb the mountain, and there's the slippery way, Muzdalifah. There it is. You can go up and go down the mountain. You get to the top, and at the top of the mountain, there's a tomb there for Aaron. And but thousands of people could gather at the top of the mountain and watch the sunset, and then come down. I mean, all of those descriptions fit the city of Petra. You can find all of the places as you walk around. So it had Christians in it because there was a Christian quarter that the Christians had some churches in it, but the rest of the city was a pagan city. Now, if you remember, Muhammad, he had his wife's cousin, I think, was a Nestorian monk or priest. And so that doesn't make sense in Mecca and Saudi Arabia that there would be a Nestorian priest there. Makes perfect sense in Petra.
Are
All
you
of the stories that
to,
you read
are you referring to
so
Mark up and
there
down?
are two Meccas. That's the point I want to make. Two Meccas. The Mecca in southern Jordan and the Mecca down in Saudi Arabia. And as you read people like this, by the time Al-Tabari and others get to 200 or 300 years after Muhammad, they're both called both called Mecca, and they get merged together. So you only know of one story, Mecca, and it's all of that. Everyone thinks all of that took place in Saudi Arabia. They haven't divided it up into the two Meccas and the different stories that are taking place at different times. As an example, in the original Kaaba was in the corner of the courtyard. It was very narrow around the backside where people could walk around, and they had this big courtyard, and then they would go around the backside. And so we have the story where one of the caliphs came along and he bought up properties and cleared it all out and made sure there was a big area all around the Kaaba building. You go to Petra, it's still a narrow place around the back, just as it's described. But if you go to Saudi Arabia, that's where the caliph went and made it in the middle of a great big open area, so no buildings were close to it. So you have to decide when you're reading, is this the Mecca there or is this the Mecca down here? Which Mecca are they talking about? Look carefully, look at the archaeology, and you can very quickly decide which one of these Kaabas. There's a Kaaba in the north, a Kaaba in the south. Those are the kinds of things I'm discovering. There's a lot of supporting evidence, and I've just asked people, and Muslims as well, look at the evidence. Go look at the Kaabas, at the Qiblas. Where do the Qiblas point? Look at the archaeology we found, and people are writing me. I have hundreds of emails that I get, and lots of them have good ideas. Well, what about this, or how does this fit? And so I'm studying every day, trying to put together every week a video or two about the things that we discover as we look at the history of Islam. Okay.
Amazing. Can you hear me now, or?
It's hard, but if you talk loud.
Okay, I'm sorry. But you were talking about Mecca and Mecca. Now, I got to mention here to all our viewers, all Mr. Gibson work is in our channel. We have a playlist under his name, and I'm going to put all their work, all the links under in the description box here. You can see his amazing documentary called The Sacred City. Allow me to say it in Arabic also. الفيلم الوثائقي المشهور فيه دكتور جيبسون موجود في القناة وسأضعه في الرابط هنا. It's very clear. I mean, watching it is amazing. You were talking about you got to decide this Qibla or that Qibla. Looking at your work, how the way you described it, I think Petra's Jordan, that's the Qibla. I want to go a little bit backward about the black stone. Where that black stone came from and why it's so important to Muslims?
Lots of people have questions about this black rock that's down there, the black stone. It's hard to know if other black stones in history are the same black stone. So originally, in the Nabatean people who lived up around Petra, over into the Negev, they had a black stone that they worshipped. And this is written down by other histories. Other nations have seen this and wrote down, these Arabs, they worship a black stone. There are some descriptions given. It's a black stone that they worship. And so we can find it mentioned back in history in different places. Is it exactly the same black stone? That's very hard. I mean, we can't go and do DNA tests because we don't know. We can't put it together. But we do know that a black stone was very important in the worship around the city of Petra. And if you go to the city of Petra, you can see the Kaaba building, and each of the corners is named. And so in Saudi Arabia, it's very hard to understand, why is the Yemeni corner over here, the black stone over here where it actually faces Yemen? Why is the Iraqi corner up at the north, and why is the Sham corner over on the side here? Like they don't sit right. If you go to Petra, then you discover the Iraq corner faces Iraq. The Sham corner faces Sham. The black stone faces the side, and the Yemeni corner faces Yemen. The corners even make sense in Petra, where it's hard to figure out why did they name the corners the way they did down in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So there are so many different pieces of evidence that we can pull together and look at. And so it's not just one thing. The book that's out there, the website and others, we try to go through in the book, the early Islamic Qiblas. There's over 50 different pieces of evidence. One good, interesting one is just in the last couple years, they've been doing studies on the language of Arabic. Where did the Arabic of the Quran originate? And a lot of people down through history, the Muslim scholars down through history have said, what's a Bedouin language? But they've gone through and studied all of the Bedouin languages, starting hundreds of years ago up to now. They've never found a Bedouin dialect that is the same as the Quran. And if you go out and look at all the different things that people have written in the desert, and you write down, one of the things that's interesting is that when you use the word the, so you want to say al-bayt, so use the word el for this. And in all of the writing, they use the word hun, H-N. And so that goes all the way back. If you go down to Saudi Arabia, there's always H-N, H-N. So where did this El come from? Al-Bayt, and Al-Medina and so forth. Well, it comes from Petra. When they got the Petra scrolls out and they can look at all of the names and everything, they discover they use the word El all the time in Petra. That was a local dialect. It matches what they've been looking for, searching for, the origins of Quranic Arabic, and they have found it in the city of Petra. That's only just coming out now in the last couple of weeks as things are being written and people are publishing papers. So more and more supportive evidence is coming out. It's an exciting thing to be involved in. And we're only going to touch a little bit here on this interview. Another question.
Well, yeah, no, this is supporting your story, your theory, 100%.
All the time. I just find out there's new stuff all the time. I'm waiting for something big to come to say, no, it couldn't be. I'm all wrong. It can't happen, and so forth. But I mean, see, some people come along and say, "Well, what about Zamzam? Okay, the well Zamzam. It's there in Mecca." Well, let's go back in history. Where did the name Zamzam come from? ZMZM. It's not an Arab name, Zamzam. Okay, so if you go back in history, you will read that there were a group of people known as the Zamzimians. And where did the Zamzimians live? They lived in Mount Seir. Mount Seir is the early name for the mountains where Petra is. So if you want to find the well of the Zamzimians, you find it in the city of Petra. Now, it's interesting, after Ibn Zubair moved the Black Rock down to Mecca, and after, there were then two Kaabas, and there was all this fighting over which way do we pray. In the middle of all that, Al-Tabri says, in this year, Zamzam was lost. What does that mean? They lost Zamzam. They had no idea where it was. How do you lose a well? Well, if it's in Petra, the original Zamzam, it can be lost because there were floods, there were things going on, nobody was maintaining things, and a lot of dirt came in, and a flood came through and washed it all away, and it's lost. So it's not till many years later that there is suddenly now a Zamzam in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And so all of these things moved. You see, we think sometimes that there's continuance, that people remembered all these things. The same thing happened in Christianity. Around 300 years after Christ, people set out to find these early spots that were mentioned in Scripture. So there were lots of different people who went to the Middle East to try to find out where was the tomb of Jesus, and where was the cross put up, and where was Elijah, and where was his town. And so they went around looking for these spots. And that's why sometimes you find 3 or 4 different spots people claim the same thing for, because it was lost in history. The same thing happened in Islam, that when later on, 600 years after the Hijrah, you have people like Yakut. He's writing all the geography of Islam, and he's trying to figure out where are these things. So he's walking around Mecca saying, okay, there was a great market here called Aqaba. And so there was, and that's where the market was. And so he couldn't find Aqaba anywhere. It means, Aqaba sort of means going up. So he found a spot where there's sort of a slope going up in the mountains. And he said, this is Aqaba. And they built a mosque there and said, this is Aqaba. Well, if you're in Petra and somebody asks you, where's Aqaba? They'll all look at you strange, because everybody knows where Aqaba is. It's still called Aqaba to this day. And there was a great market there. And there were, but it's been lost over time, and so the Muslims had to find it down in Saudi Arabia. They did the same thing, Battle of Badr. They had to find a spot and put it there. They had to find places. So they, even in the graveyard in Mecca, they put up these markers. Like, I don't think they're tombs, because they can't be tombs because there's no bodies in them, but they put up memorial places. And then people started coming there trying to get some sort of barakah, praying and over the tombs of the saints and so forth. So Saudi came along and bulldozed them all out. But one of the things, I was looking at the old pictures of that graveyard, and there are tombs there of people who we know died in other places. There's one person there we know who died in Gaza and was buried in Gaza, yet there was a grave in that graveyard for that person in Mecca. So even the things that are there, people said, oh, this is this house of so-and-so, or this is the grave of so-and-so. There's no actual proof that those are the houses or the graves. And in some places, Saudis just looked and said, they're obviously wrong. I mean, this is not the grave of somebody important. And so that whole graveyard was bulldozed. Now, the graveyard in Medina, that's no problem. And Medina is there. Medina is where it's supposed to be. The Hijrah was from Petra in the north, and they came down to Medina and stayed there and so forth. If you notice the wars that took place in Medina, whenever the Quraysh attacked, they always attacked from the north, coming down. When they built the ditch in Medina for the Battle of the Ditch, where did they build it? On the north side of the city. So all of the geography fits. When you put Petra there, suddenly you can read the historical accounts and it makes sense. It makes sense how the battles took place. It makes sense what the people said, because the geography fits. So all I'm saying is we must go back and look at the actual stones, the actual buildings, the foundations of buildings. They tell a different story than what Islam tells us. Okay.
Great. I just read manuscripts in Yemen, what they found in the big mosque, and they hid it immediately. Can you, if you know about this more, anyone reach out?
I do, but I'm not an expert on the Quran or on early Qurans, and so I can just give my opinion, but
your
that's
opinion
not
is
my
good.
area. But as for experts, I mean, I have had Islamic experts write to me. People from the Saudi government, from the Ministry of Antiquities, have written and asked for copies of my books and asked for things because they are examining these things. I am waiting, and I have an open invitation for expert. I'm just saying this is what the stones tell us. You can go and measure the stones. I can find an early mosque, find out when it was built, measure it. Here's the Qibla wall. What direction did they pray? And we can do that and give you the maps. And you have maps there. But if people want to, the film is of the Sacred City. If you go onto the website and look for the website, thesacredcity.ca. I'm a Canadian, so it's a Canadian website. And then you can look for data, and then look at the data and find the Qibla tool. You can click at which ones point to Petra, which ones point to Mecca, which ones were built during Muhammad's lifetime, which ones were built during Abu Bakr's lifetime. You can take all this data and move it around yourself and try to figure out what happened.
Well, my personal opinion, or when I read the Islamic history, I go strongly with your theory more than Bukhari. And mentioning Bukhari now, how come a man from Bukharistan or somewhere in North Iran, I believe in that area, doesn't speak Arabic well, and 200 years or 300 years after Muhammad, collect all these stories, and he has no internet, no Wi-Fi, no computer, and most of Islam, Bukhari and Islam in the Middle East now, if you cross path with him, I mean, it's a red line. You cannot criticize Bukhari.
Yeah, there were lots of things happening there. So the city of Baghdad was central, and so scholars all came to Baghdad. Libraries were in Baghdad, and that allowed people to talk, to meet each other, to write, to research. And I think Bukhari did an honest job. I mean, when he talks about what direction did they pray, what direction did Muhammad pray before he, faced Mecca and Saudi Arabia, or Mecca, just the city of Mecca, he only mentions Al-Quds once, as far as I remember. Maybe it's twice, but he mentions Sham, praying towards Sham and so forth. He does give us a variety of different things that people say. And so we can't just go back and quote one, because there's several. The same thing with Al-Tabri. I have a lot of respect for Al-Tabri. Just as an example, when the question comes up, which son did Abraham take with him up to the top of the mountain to sacrifice? If you're reading Al-Tabri, you'll come and you'll see he has a whole page, 10 different, people and all the stand there, all the who heard it from who and so forth. And he has a whole page, 10 of these down, and they all say it was Ishmael. Turn the page, and he'll give you another 10, and all important people are all in this snad, that's the way I want to hear, and who are all there, and they said it was Isaac. Okay? And he doesn't tell us one or the other. So some people will come and say, well, Al-Tabri says this, but Al-Tabri is very fair. You turn the page and then you'll discover he also gives the other side of the story, and you could go and look at both, but he doesn't take sides in the argument. He just says this is the way it was. So, I mean, he's trying, I read these guys, I think they're trying to be truthful, but they have problems because they're 300 years late, and they cannot say anything against the Abbasids. They cannot say anything against that would dishonor the Prophet. They cannot say anything that might in any way dishonor Islam. And so now they're trying to give the history, but they have to, it's a whitewashed history. It has to be, not giving any bad image whatsoever in it. And so you have to remember that when you read them.
Yes, actually, this is the question I want to ask you about, because in several occasions, you were talking about Islamic historian misunderstanding and said, quote, there was not deliberate falsehood. It was misunderstanding what happened during the founding years of Islam. And that's end of quote. Where Muslims, historians, and scholars were making honest mistake or deliberately. And you mentioned twice, you said they were honest.
Right.
But
I really don't think they set out to lie to us. I really don't. Because they weren't making up stories. You see, lies can be easily uncovered. I think they were honestly presenting what they thought at the time. That's the way I read history. When I read Strabo, who's a Roman historian, he's trying to present the history that he knows and he saw at the time. So I have to understand that's Strabo's perspective, but he's trying to be honest. Now, he did live in the home of a Roman general, and the government gave him money. So, I mean, okay, he doesn't say anything bad about Rome. Rome was wonderful and glorious because he's being paid by the Romans. But he's not making things up, but he's coloring things. And so as we read Islamic history, it was colored in different ways. Words were carefully chosen, what they said or didn't say. But I don't get the feeling that they were out there to make up stories and to make up lies. I think people at that time really believed these things. This is the stuff they had heard. This is the stuff that the historians wrote down. It's not like somebody's coming along and saying, I'm going to mislead all these people. I'm going to make up all these lies. I don't think that's what happened. But I think because the historians are so late, they are writing down at that time what they've heard from people. And I don't think anybody started way back at the beginning and said, let's make up a big lie and see who we can fool with this. Because that is not the way it happens. It usually happens without intention. I'll give you an example. Almost every American I meet tells me that when Christopher Columbus was going out to discover America, he was afraid of sailing off the edge of the world and falling off because they believed the world was flat. Now, there are lots of historians, and there's at least 2 PhDs that I know, or theses anyway, that I know, that people have done this thing. Where are the flat earth people? You know something? They didn't exist. So where did that story come from about falling off the edge of the world? It comes from a guy named Irvin Washington who wrote a novel. He wrote a novel back in the 1700s on the life of Christopher Columbus. But he needed somebody to be against Christopher, somebody to oppose him. So he invented the flat earth people, and they were afraid he's going to fall off the edge of the earth. He invented them in a novel, but today in America, I don't know, 80-90% of the people will tell you that Christopher Columbus was afraid of falling off the edge of the earth. It's in our history books. And it's not true, but Irvin Washington didn't set out deliberately to fool America. He just created some part of his story to fit the rest of it. It was a good story, but he added something. So when I read the Islamic history and it says so-and-so told it to so-and-so, who told it to so-and-so, who told it to so-and-so, my question is, did the story get a little bigger every time the story is told? Because that's the way I hear stories. My friend goes fishing and he caught a fish this big. By the time it gets around to everybody's telling me he caught this giant fish, because the story gets bigger. It changes a little bit. And so when I read Al-Tabari, when I read Bukhari, I understand they're trying to figure out history. But they have to deal with these stories where Muhammad becomes more important, he becomes bigger, the whole story becomes more glorious, and they can't say any bad stuff, and so it grows. Now, that doesn't mean anybody's lying. I don't think they were deliberately lying, but I think it's just the way history goes. If we don't have an eyewitness, then it's very hard to know, is this story actually true, or did it grow? Or are you telling me the story because you want to convince me of a point, and you're putting a certain emphasis on it?
I agree. Somehow they were beautifying the history, and a lot.
We all do it. We all do it.
Yeah, but the exaggeration also, Mr. Gibson, we do at the channel here in Arabic. We read these stories by Al-Bukhari's, and we found major exaggeration and lies. Yeah. It's not only beautifying, actually lying. I mean, I'm sure you come.
Yeah, but I don't think I'm not going to blame Bukhari, because he's simply trying to tell you what was being said at the time.
So just what they call it, the Chinese. There's a name to it after following you so long, and
well, you see, this is where it moves away from the stones of archaeology, and now we're talking about what could this be, what could that be. Yes. And that's where I like to keep going back to the stones and say, what do you do with all the mosques in the first 100 years of Islam pointing to Petra? What do you do with that? What do you do with Hajjaj, who's building a between mosque? And he's got over 20 mosques that point neither to Petra or Mecca, just point in the middle of Arabia. What do you do with the parallel mosques in North Africa, where they're all pointing down into South Africa? They're all very similar. I mean, and then why did the Abbasids come along and everything after that is Mecca and Saudi Arabia? Like, there's something happened in those early days of Islam, and it's a different story than what we have traditionally heard. And so that's really all I'm out here to say is we need to go back, you need to look at these rocks and figure out what is the actual story, what really took place in Arabia 1,500 years ago. And archaeology is telling us a different story.
Okay, great. Now we about an hour, 15 minutes. Do you mind, Mr. Gibson got to go, it's an hour and 15 minutes, but would you promise us to be with us again?
Sure, we'll do this again.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me, and hopefully we'll get this sorted out.
Thank you, sir. You have a great evening.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And thank you all for watching. We'll see you soon.